Hey guys, in today's video, we'll be going over how to install the Biloba glass door hinge. The Biloba glass door hinge is the hydraulic glass door hinge that we offer. Inside the box, there'll be the hinge, an additional shim along with the ones that are already pre-installed on the hinge cover plate, and the Biloba hinge backing plate. Now we make these backing plates in-house. They are used to properly locate the hinge on the door jamb. They also allow you to adjust the hinges up and down once the door is installed. If you do not have this backing plate, you can still install the hinge on the door. However, let us know if you need one. We will also send 1-inch self-tapping taper-headed screws. These will be used to anchor the hinge onto the door jamb. Lastly, on the hinge itself, there will be holes that are pre-drilled and countersunk in the center. These holes are for the hinge backing plate. Again, if you have a situation where these holes are not drilled into the hinge can still be installed onto the door jamb. Something else you can use is you can use the instructions that come with the hinge. The instructions that come with the hinge will explain how many shims that need to be used on the hinge itself. It also goes over how to adjust the speed of the hydraulic hinge, and there are some general instructions for anchoring the hinge to the door jamb. Now they're not specific to our product, however, the installation concept is very similar. Before getting started, I want to quickly go over the location of the hinge on the door jamb. With the backing plate installed, the 4 other holes on the hinge will overlap the door jamb. We'll be running our anchoring screws into these 4 hole locations once we have the door height set. The first thing we'll need to do is install the backing plate into the door jamb. With the backing plate in place, we can then take our hinge and align the center hole with the backing plate. Once in the correct position, run the set screw through the hinge and into the backing plate on both the top and the bottom. With the hinge attached to the backing plate, it will allow you to move the hinge up and down on the door jamb. This will come into play when we need to align the hinge with the holes on the door, and also when we go to set the height of the door. With one hinge installed, we'll go ahead and get the other hinge installed. Before installing the door onto the hinge, we need to remove the plate that is pre-installed on the hinge. As you can see, there's a shim that is pre-installed onto the plate, as well as a shim pre-installed onto the hinge. There are also round bushings on the standoff pieces of the hinge. Per the instruction, we need to add the shim that came with the hinge to work for a 3/8 inch glass door. So we'll go ahead and place the shim on the hinge. With the hinge set up properly, we can now install the door onto the hinges. When installing the door, we recommend having at least 2 people. One person to handle the door, and the other person to handle installing the door onto the hinges. Once we're ready to install the door, we can go ahead and pre-locate the hinges on the jamb to be near the holes on the door. Now there's a couple ways you can do this. You can either align the door with the hinges and adjust the hinges to where they need to be, or you can measure off the floor to the holes in the door and preset the hinges on the jamb. Once you have the hinges located properly, place the door over the standoff pieces on the hinges. Once the door is on the hinge, you can then take the other plate and the two bolts and place it onto the hinge and run the bolts through the plate and in the other half of the hinge to secure the door to the hinge. With our door secured to the hinges, we can now set the proper height for the door. With our door height calculation, it allows for a 1/2 inch gap between the bottom of the door and the floor, and a 1/4 inch gap between the top of the door and the door header. When we're adjusting for height, we want to make sure that there's proper clearance at the floor, and we want to make sure the top of the door is within the door header. To adjust the door for height, you can place the door on a shim to preset it at the correct height. Once we have the door at the correct height, you can then tighten the set screws and the backing plate to lock the hinge in place. Now, once you have the set screws tightened, you can remove the shim and use the door to make sure there's proper clearances at the floor and at the door header. Now, there may be a situation where the weight of the door is too heavy for the backing plates and the door may slip down. If that's the case, go ahead and leave your shim under the door. You just want to make sure that the top of the door is within the door header. Once we have the door at the proper height, go ahead and tighten on the set screws. Now there is a tight fit between the door and the set screws, but you can get to them with a standard screwdriver. With our door set at the correct height, we can now install the anchoring screws. When installing the anchoring screws, you'll need to leave the door open to access the two inside holes and close the door to access the two outside holes. When installing the anchoring screws, you can use an 1/8 inch drill bit to pre-drill holes through the open holes on the hinge and into the door jamb. Now, something you want to be conscious of is the location of the drill in comparison to the edge of the door. The hole locations are fairly tight to the edge of the door, therefore when you're running your drill, you want to make sure the drill does not contact the edge of the door. So we'll go ahead and pre-drill our holes in the hinges and then close the door and repeat the process on the outside. With the hinges anchored to the door jamb, operate the door to make sure it closes and opens properly. Now, typically with Biloba hinges, we do not see any issues with the edge of the door contacting the hinge. If for whatever reason you have that issue, what you can do is you can loosen up the bolts on the hinge and press the door out, which will bring the edge of the door away from the hinge. Once you have it in the correct spot, go ahead and tighten those bolts back down. With the hinge installed, you can then install the finish plate onto the hinge. With the hinge complete, we can now go over how to adjust the speed of the hinges. The last thing we'll need to do is adjust the speed of the hinges. To adjust the speed of the hinges, there's a speed adjustment valve located on the top or the bottom of the hinge. The location of the valve is dependent on the swing of the door. To slow the hinges down, you turn the valve clockwise. To speed the hinges up, you turn the valve counterclockwise. Now it's important to make the same adjustment for each hinge, meaning whatever adjustment you make to one hinge, you need to make the same adjustment to the other hinge. If the hinges are out of sync, the doors will either slam shut or they'll get caught open. Here's an example of a door with the hinges set to the correct speed. Now, something you want to keep in mind is if you have any type of latching hardware, whether it be a lock set or if you have a roller latch, you want to make sure that the speed is set so the door will latch properly. If you don't have any latching hardware, then you just want to have a nice consistent speed on the hinges. So once you have the speed set, the installation of the Biloba hinge is complete. If you have any questions, please contact our office.